She doesn't belong here. She never did. Tamsin heard it clearly. The woman who said it didn't bother lowering her voice, didn't see the point, probably. Why whisper when the whole room already agreed? The Alderpine Charity Auction was held every autumn in the top floor of the Smirked Hotel in downtown Toronto. White tablecloths, crystal stemware. Men in suits that cost more than Tamsin made in 3 months. She had worn the only dress she owned that didn't have a loose hem. A navy blue thing she'd bought at a consignment shop in Parkdale 2 years ago, and she'd stood in front of her bathroom mirror for almost 20 minutes before she stopped trying to make it look like something it wasn't. Her sister Celeste had loaned her a pair of shoes, then taken them back the day before, saying she'd decided to wear them herself. So Tamsin stood near the south wall of the auction room in a pair of black flats she'd bought at Shoppers Drug Mart, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't drunk, watching Celeste work the room. Celeste was very good at rooms. She had their mother's coloring, that particular kind of golden-haired, sharp-cheeked beauty that made men straighten their ties without realizing they were doing it, and she had spent her whole life learning how to use it. She laughed at the right moments. She touched people's arms. She said things like, "I've heard so many wonderful things about you," to people she'd met 30 seconds ago, and she said it like she meant it every time. Their father, Hector, had brought them both. That was how Tamsin had ended up here. He'd called her at work on a Wednesday afternoon. She had been in the middle of reconciling a vendor account for the 3rd time because someone in procurement kept misclassifying expenses and said, "The Alderpine thing is Saturday. Celeste is coming. Come with us." He hadn't said please. He never did with Tamsin. With Celeste, he said please. "I'm busy Saturday," she'd said. "You're never busy," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. She wasn't sure why she'd come. She told herself it was to keep the peace. She told herself she owed him something for paying 2 months of her rent 4 years ago when she'd just started at the firm and hadn't had a paycheck yet. She was still paying that back somehow, even though there had never been a formal accounting of it. That was how debt worked in her family. It didn't have numbers. You just owed, and nobody ever told you when it was settled. The woman who had said she didn't belong here was someone she vaguely recognized. A city councillor's wife, maybe, late 50s. Hair done up in a way that had taken considerable time and effort to make look effortless. She was talking to 2 other women in a cluster near the champagne table, and all 3 of them glanced toward Tamsin as she stood against the wall, then looked away with the particular speed of people confirming something they'd already decided. Tamsin took a slow breath. She was good at slow breaths. She'd had a lot of practice. She looked down at the program in her hand. 14 items up for auction. A wine cellar consultation, a weekend at a lake house in Muskoka, an original painting by an artist whose name she didn't recognize, but who apparently had representation in 3 countries. The proceeds went to pediatric cardiac research. She had read that 3 times now. She was reading it a 4th time when she became aware that someone had stopped near her. She didn't look up right away. Most people at events like this didn't stop near Tamsin. They flowed around her the way water moved around a stone, not avoiding her exactly, just not registering her as something worth pausing for. But this person had stopped and wasn't moving. She looked up. The man was, she didn't have an immediate word for what he was. Tall, yes. Dark-suited, yes. But the suit itself was the kind that sat so well on a person's shoulders that it stopped being clothing and became something else, some kind of statement about what it cost to stand the way this man was standing. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she thought. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples. There was a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, running from just below his ear to his chin, pale and healed, old enough that he'd stopped noticing it years ago. He was looking at the program in her hand. Not at her. At the program. "They've mispriced Lot 7, he said. Tamsin looked down at the program again. Lot 7 was the Muskoka Lake House weekend, listed at $4,000 opening bid. Property tax records for that address show the house was assessed at just over $2 million last year, she said before she'd decided to say anything. If they're trying to raise real money, $4,000 is barely an insult. A beat of silence. She looked up again. He was watching her now. They should have opened at 12, she said, because she apparently wasn't done. If they'd done their homework. They didn't do their homework, he said. No, they didn't. He didn't smile. She noticed that. Most men, when they spoke to women at events like this, especially women standing alone against a wall in off-the-rack dresses, produced a smile at some point, either out of politeness or as a method of reassurance, the way you might show a dog your open hand before approaching it. This man produced nothing of the sort. He just looked at her with eyes the color of winter ice and said, "How do you know what the assessment was?" I looked it up on the MPAC database 2 days ago when my father mentioned what the event was. I got curious. Why? She blinked. Because I always look things up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a business card and held it out toward her. She took it without thinking. No logo, just a name, Devereaux, in plain black serif font. A phone number beneath it. Nothing else. "If you know how to read numbers," he said, "I have a use for someone like that." Then he walked away. Her father found her about 3 minutes later, which meant he had been watching. "Do you know who that was?" he said. His voice had a particular quality to it that she hadn't heard very often. Low, careful, the way he spoke when something had unsettled him, and he didn't want to admit it. "His name is Devereaux," she said. "His full name," Hector said, "is Luc Devereaux. He runs Meridian Group. I don't know what that is." Her father looked at her like she'd said something both very stupid and somehow typical. "It's a private equity firm. Asset management, real estate, private lending." He paused. "And other things, Tamsin." He glanced away briefly, then back. "Stay away from him." She turned the card over in her hand. "He offered me a job." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. "He what?" "He said he had a use for someone who could read numbers." Celeste appeared at her father's elbow as if she'd been conjured. Which, Tamsin thought, she probably had been. She had a gift for materializing wherever things were happening. She scanned the room quickly, located Devereaux near the bar on the far side, and then looked at Tamsin with an expression that wasn't quite contempt but lived next door to it. "You spoke to him," Celeste said. "We discussed Lot 7. You discussed Lot 7. Celeste repeated this as if it were something to be examined under glass. "Tamsin, men like that don't talk to." She stopped, edited herself. "He's not someone you should be involved with." "I know," Tamsin said. "Dad told me." "Dad's right." She pocketed the card. She called the number on a Tuesday 2 weeks later. She'd told herself she wouldn't. She'd told herself it was insane. That she knew nothing about Meridian Group, except that it was the kind of company that didn't have a public-facing website, which was either because it didn't need one or because it didn't want one. And she wasn't sure which of those possibilities was worse. She'd done 4 hours of research over 3 evenings, which is how she found out that Meridian Group held interests in 14 Canadian companies, controlled 2 offshore holding structures she could only trace to their first layer, and had never once appeared in a business publication, despite moving what appeared to be, based on property registry filings and corporate disclosures, somewhere north of $400 million in assets over the past 5 years. She called because she was behind 3 months on her credit card, because her firm had just announced a hiring freeze that also covered raises, because she was 31 years old and still paying rent in Parkdale, and she was tired, so genuinely exhausted in a way that had seeped into her bones, of being the kind of person who looked things up and understood them precisely and still somehow came out the other side of every equation with less than she'd started with. A woman answered. Efficient voice. Gave nothing away. Tamsin stated her name and said she was returning a call from Mr. Devereaux. There was a pause, then, "Hold, please." He came on the line after 45 seconds. "You waited longer than I expected," he said. "I wanted to do some research first, and I have questions." "Come in Thursday," he said. 10 o'clock. I'll have someone send you the address." The address turned out to be an office building in the financial district. Glass and steel, understated in the way that very expensive things tended to be understated, as if they had nothing to prove to you. Meridian Group occupied the 22nd floor. The reception area had no name on the wall, no logo, just good furniture and good light, and a woman at a desk who looked at Tamsin and said, without warmth but also without rudeness, "He's expecting you." The office itself was corner-facing, 2 walls of windows. Below them the city spread out grey and enormous in the late October light. Devereaux was standing when she entered, looking out at it, and he didn't turn immediately. She noticed a cup of coffee on his desk, untouched and probably cold. She noticed the stack of files to the left of his monitor, 6 inches thick, bound with rubber bands. She noticed the photograph on the windowsill, or the space where a photograph might have been now empty, a faint square of cleaner glass where something had sat for a long time before being removed. When he turned, she thought again that he looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. It was a different kind of tired, the kind that came from carrying things. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Tell me what you found," he said, "in your research." She told him. She laid it out clearly, the holding structures, the asset movements she could trace, the gaps where she couldn't. She told him which layer of Meridian's structure she could see and which she couldn't, and she told him how she'd arrived at the parts she couldn't see, which was its own kind of information. He listened without interrupting, with the focused stillness of a man who was accustomed to information being brought to him, and who had learned to separate what mattered from what didn't. When she finished, he said, "You're 3 layers in. Most people don't get past the first. I had 4 evenings and a public database." "I know." He paused. "I had you checked before you called." She kept her expression level. "And certified general accountant. 6 years at Barton Fielding. Average billing, above average accuracy rate. You flagged a tax 3 years ago that your firm took credit for." She felt the familiar pull of that particular bitterness and she kept it off her face. "That's accurate. The man whose books you found it in," Devereaux said, "was a supplier to one of my companies." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "No, but I knew who found it." He moved to his desk and sat, which somehow changed the geometry of the room. He was still composed, still, but something settled into place. "I have a problem," he said. "Someone inside my organization has been moving money. Not stealing exactly, rerouting. Small amounts, consistent pattern, across accounts that should have no connection to each other. My people have not found it. I want you to find it." Tamsin looked at him carefully. "Why not bring in forensic accountants?" "Because forensic accountants file reports," he said, "and reports exist." She understood what he wasn't saying. The money being moved through those accounts, wherever it had come from, was not money that could be introduced into a formal investigation process, without consequences that had nothing to do with the thief. "If I find it," she said, "what happens to the person who did it?" He looked at her steadily. "That's not your department. I need to know what I'm handing someone over to." A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not softened exactly, but recalibrated, like a scale adjusting to an unexpected weight. "They'll leave the organization," he said finally, "with enough to start somewhere else. They won't be harmed." She didn't know whether to believe him, she thought, and this surprised her that she might, not because he seemed kind, but because he said it like a man accounting for something, not promising something. There was a difference. "I want to see all the accounts," she said. "Full access. No filtered version agreed. I work from here, not remotely. Paper trail stays with you, not me." "Agreed. I name my rate. You don't negotiate it." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his face and was gone. "What's your rate?" she told him. It was twice what she made at the firm. She'd prepared herself for pushback. He said, "Agreed," without blinking. She took the files home that night, the ones she was permitted to take, and she sat at her kitchen table in Parkdale until 2 in the morning, with a highlighter and a pot of tea going cold beside her, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, like she was exactly where her brain had been trained to be. She told no one. Not her father, not Celeste. Celeste called on a Friday evening 3 weeks in, and the call had the particular texture of calls from Celeste, which was to say, it felt like being assessed under a light designed to show every flaw. "Dad says you've been busy," Celeste said. I have been. New client? Consulting work. A pause. You left the firm, I'm on leave. Tamsin? Celeste's voice shifted slightly. Not into concern exactly, but into something adjacent to it. You know how you are. You get attached to things that aren't what you think they are. You did it with that Brampton firm and they let you go after 3 months. You did it with Marcus and that went nowhere. You have a tendency to, I have to go, Tamsin said. I'm just trying to, good night, Celeste. She hung up and sat with her phone face down on the table for a moment. Then she went back to the spreadsheet. She found the pattern on a Wednesday in the 4th week. It was elegant, actually. She sat back from the screen when she saw it and spent a moment just looking at it, the way you looked at a piece of architecture that was technically something awful but was still, in its own way, beautiful. Someone had built a routing path through 4 apparently unrelated accounts. 2 corporate, 1 numbered, 1 registered to what looked like a real estate holding, but when you cross-referenced it against property registrations, didn't correspond to any actual property. And they were moving money in amounts calibrated to stay below reporting thresholds. The intervals between movements had a pattern too, but not a regular one. Irregular enough to avoid automated flags, regular enough to belong to a human being with consistent habits. She spent 2 more days building the full picture. Then she asked to meet with Devereaux. He came into the small conference room she'd been working in, closed the door, and sat across from her. She slid the printed summary toward him. He read it without expression. He turned pages slowly, methodically, the way she imagined he read everything. When he reached the last page, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. You found it in 4 weeks, he said. I found it in 3.5. I spent the last few days making sure. He looked at her, really looked. Not the way he'd been looking at her, which was the way you looked at someone doing a job, but something different, like something had shifted in the geometry of how he was seeing her. My people have been looking for 8 months, he said. They were looking in the wrong layer. She pulled the paper back and pointed to a column in the middle of page 2. Every time they got close, someone flagged the inquiry. Which means the person who built this also controls at least partial access to your audit trail. He was still looking at her. You need to change your internal access protocols, she said, because she apparently couldn't stop being thorough. Or someone else will build the same thing in 18 months, and you'll be back to square one. Would you do that? He said. Build the protocols. She looked up. That wasn't the agreement. I know. He said it evenly. I'm asking something new. She thought about the Parkdale apartment and the credit card and the way her father had looked at her at the auction when she'd said Devereaux had offered her a job. She thought about Celeste's voice on the phone, smooth and certain, and already so sure of how things would turn out. I'd need to see the full structure first, she said. Not the filtered version. Yes, he said, and the rate changes. Name it. She did. He didn't flinch. One more thing, she said. He waited. The persons who built this. She hesitated, then asked it directly because she had been raised in a family where nobody asked things directly, and she'd made a decision somewhere in her 20s to be different. Do you know who it is? He held her gaze for a moment. Yes, and the offer you made me, they leave, they're not harmed. You'll hold to that? Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully read. It wasn't annoyance. It wasn't the dismissal she'd half expected. It was the look of a man who had been asked to be accountable to something and was, against some instinct, choosing to be. I'll hold to it, he said. She nodded once, looked back down at the spreadsheet. Then we have a new agreement, she said. She stayed late that night. So did he, though she only knew because the light under his office door was still on at 9:30 when she walked past it on her way to the elevator. She stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't calculation. It was something simpler and more inconvenient than either of those things, and she stood there in the hallway, with her bag over her shoulder and her coat in her arms, and she thought about what Celeste would say if she could see her, standing in the corridor of a man like Devereaux's office at 9:30 at night, having just agreed to redesign his internal financial controls, not knowing the full shape of what she'd walked into, and not, if she was honest with herself, entirely minding. She walked past the door. She pressed the elevator button. Behind her, the light was still on. She rode down 22 floors in silence. The city was dark and lit and enormous outside the lobby windows, and she walked through the revolving door into the cold and pulled her coat on and thought about numbers, the way she always did when she was thinking through something she didn't have language for yet. Money moved. Patterns emerged. If you looked at enough of them, you stopped seeing the amounts and started seeing the logic behind them. The intent. The person. She didn't know Devereaux yet. Not really. But she knew how someone thought from how they built things. She pulled out the card, the one from the auction, worn soft at the corners now, 3 months in her pocket. She looked at it once. Then she put it back. She had work to do in the morning. The numbers, as always, were waiting.